right, we're ready to go. I will say this for the last time in our series, turn to Romans chapter 4. We're going to conclude that today. Next week we move into chapter 5. We're going to wrap up here looking at verses 18 to 25 today. And we're looking once again at the faith of Abraham. I hope you remember that has been our focus here. Paul has taken the story of Abraham and said that in order to understand the gospel, and gospel means good news, in order to understand the good news that God has brought salvation, you need to understand how God works. And he is saying that the story of Abraham is the most complete tale you will find in the Old Testament that tells you how God redeems man. And as we're looking at this, he is saying that the way that God has always acted, the way that God has always reconciled man to himself has been by grace alone, through faith alone. And that is the core of the gospel message. That's what we've been building up to. If you remember in chapter 1, verse 18, all the way down to chapter 3, verse 20, we looked at the bad news. Remember we started the good news with the bad news. And the bad news came to this. Man stands under judgment of God. And why was man under the judgment of God? Let's try that for you. Was it just a misunderstanding? Was man just misled? Didn't have enough information to go on? Why was man under judgment? He suppressed the truth. God put himself forward in creation, said, here I am. You can see who I am, the power that I have, and you can see the nature of my care for you if you just look at what I've done. And man looked into the face of God, looked into his creation, and man said what? No thank you. Not interested. I'll make my own gods. I'll come up with my own rules, my own ideas. And he found himself under the judgment of God. And understand that. It is not just because he didn't have enough information. It was not just because of some oops or mistake. God is judging man because he purposed to rebel. Man purposed to rebel. And then we found the good news. That was starting in chapter 3, verses 21 to 31, when the good news, God has provided a solution. And why did God have to provide a solution? Why couldn't man just fix the problem? Why couldn't he just turn around and start doing the right thing and make things right?
There's none righteous, no, not one.
Total depravity. Man had dug himself into the hole of sin and could not climb out. He could not make himself right with God again. He could not claim righteousness. In fact, there was no righteousness in him. If he was going to be made righteous, who had to provide it?
The Lord.
God was going to have to bring his righteousness and apply it to man. It was going to have to be God using his perfect mercy to satisfy his perfect justice. And how did he do that? How did he resolve that? He purposed to send a redeemer. He purposed to take sin upon himself. God would enter history in human form. He would live as a man, die for our sins, and rise again to conquer death on our behalf. All of that was the task of God. Once you understand the gospel message, it is making this plain. This is why Paul is going to the story of Abraham to set the record straight. Man can't fix his problem. He is incapable of having enough to pay the price of sin. He is incapable of regaining righteousness for himself. He cannot do this. It has to be an act of God, and that is the gospel message. God has provided a solution. Now, how effective was God's plan? Did it work out well?
For us.
I think it worked out fairly well. Did God solve the problem? Did what his plan, when God said, here's what I'll do to solve it, did it solve the problem? It certainly did. You think that handled it? How effective was it? Well, I want you to understand the cross, and this is Paul's point in making an illustration from the Old Testament. How effective was the cross in dealing with sin?
Past, present, future.
It could reach all the way back to the beginning of time to deal with all those who had lived before the cross and offer them redemption through Jesus Christ. And it can reach all the way to the end of time and offer redemption for those who will believe in Jesus Christ. And again, what is the story of Abraham? A man who trusted God for a redeemer. That is the key to understanding Abraham's story. He was saved not by what he did, but by what he believed. He trusted what God would do. And that is the core of what we're after here. Now we're going to see some things here. We saw the doctrine of this truth of the gospel in chapter 3. We're looking at the illustration of this truth in chapter 4. And next week we'll start chapter 5. And we're going to see the results of this truth in people's lives. How effective is it? Now, chapter 4 gives us this message about Abraham being saved by faith. And this is what we're going to dig into. We're going to set this. You have to know this is going to happen, right? When I start something, I always give you the overview, and then we go through it. And when I finish something, I give you the overview. So we're going to bring it all together here. Good teaching. I have to tell you this because you're probably not used to good teaching, but here we go. Good teaching. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Why do you have to do it 3 times?
Because we listen so well.
Because you don't listen so well. That's right. And we have to review. So we're coming to that section. We're going to look now and finish out this section. And we're going to look at salvation as a work of God and not man. Now, this is something I want you to understand, that Paul is making a point in his story of Abraham, which dominates all 25 verses of chapter 4. The story of Abraham is a lot more about his God than it is about Abraham. That's the key to understanding this. That is not what the Jews had done with this. The story of Abraham to the Jews was a story of a man who made himself right with God. And Paul is going back and going, if you read the story, remember that's the key element. Again, he goes, what is written? It is written. What does it actually say when you read the story? Not what everybody told you about the story, but when you read it, what does it tell you? And it's going to tell you a lot more about God than it does about Abraham. So a quick review. First off, here's a little thing for you. Despite what the Jews had taught, Abraham is not the story of the first Jew. Abraham is not the story of the first Jew. Abraham will be the father of the Jewish people, but he is not the first Jew. What was Abraham when God called him? A Gentile, a pagan Chaldean from the city of Ur. You know why he wasn't the first Jew? Because there are no Jews yet. God is calling people out to make a nation for himself, but Abraham is a pagan Chaldean living in Ur. God is telling us the story of the redemption of a pagan, a person who did not believe God, did not have the law of God, did not have a pact with God yet. This is God saving someone who did not even know about God. That's our beginning point. Understand that illustration. And that is what we're going to see here. Abraham, when he gets this story, Abraham, in Genesis 11 and 12, we see he is called. At that time, his name is Abram. Anybody know what the name Abram means? Father of many. Father of many, age 60. God speaks to Abraham, the father of many. And how many was Abraham the father of at age 60? None.
Not a zilch.
Can you think of any parents who gave a worse name to a child of theirs at that time? He was the father of none at age 60. Now, I feel a little bit for Abram, don't you? Can you imagine every time you're introduced in the ancient world, what's your name? My name's Abram, father of many. How many? Well, none.
To come. Maybe to come.
But he had to deal with that because they gave names, often were earned in time. They were assigned based on something that had actually done or accomplished. But we meet this guy, and he is called out. And he is called out by God, and Abram heads out and gets as far as the city of Haran, where he hangs out for 15 years. He didn't get anywhere near the land of Canaan where God was sending him. And he was told very specifically, do not take any of your family, leave your family behind, and go to the place that I am telling you and worship me. And Abraham immediately headed out with dad and his nephew. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like family, looks like a bad start. Very important beginning point. Does it look like God picked Abraham because he was so perfect in following orders that he was the perfect righteous man, or does it look like Abraham has some learning to do?
Yeah, ladder.
Has some learning to do. There's going to be a little curve here as we work things out. Abram at this point, finally does move on from Haran, and God talks to him again and repeats his promises in Genesis 15. And in Genesis 15, we find a little bit of a back and forth with a man of perfect faith where he is going, God, I don't know if you noticed, but I'm 75 now, and I am not the father of many. I am not even the father of one. And once again, God, did I mention I'm 75 now, and you made me a promise, and now that I'm 75, it might be a good time to start fulfilling the promise. Abraham challenges God. Now, once again, well, evidently so is his wife, who is such a hot babe that when they go into Egypt, he has to pretend it's not his wife because he knows other men are going to want her. It's kind of thing. These guys aged well, just saying. And here we go. Go get back on track. Get on here. Catch up. We're going to get back to the text here. Let's get back to what's going on. What does God do in chapter 15 of Genesis? Abram is complaining about the fact that things aren't working out, not showing tremendous faith again. And God says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to restate all my promises. In fact, I'm going to expand it here. You are going to have more descendants than the stars of the heavens, than the sands of the sea. And then God makes a contract. Here's the thing. Abram is saying, I'm not sure what's going on. Nothing seems to be happening, these promises. And God goes, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a contract that binds me to perform. Remember how they did contracts in the old days? You take a series of animals, you cut them in half, put half here, half here, half here, half here. You take birds, one bird, too small to cut in half. We'll get a bird on each side. And you make a pathway. And then the two men that were going to make this contract would start at the first animal, and they would walk side by side between the animal halves to the end of the path, and then say at the end, if I do not keep my word, you will have the right to do to me as we did to these animals. Remember that? That's a binding contract in the ancient world. Good thing you don't have to do that when you bought your house, signed for your car loan, and those kinds of things. A little different today. But keep in mind that the deal was always kept by two people, at least, who walked between the animals. And what did God do in chapter 15? He put Abraham to sleep, knocked him flat out, and God alone went between the animal halves. So here's the complaining Abraham, and what does God do? God says, I'm making a covenant with you. I'm going to set the conditions, and I alone are going to keep the conditions of the contract. Now that's a guarantee, isn't it? God says, you're going to get what I promise. I find that amazing. God does that. Scripture tells us we're redeemed because God only calls us, and not only calls us, but gives us the ability to respond in faith. You understand how much God is involved in salvation? He handles it from start to finish. Now Abraham goes on from that, and at the time that God promises at age 75, he is still the father of none. And they go on for a while, and now at the age of 86, Abram still at this point is the father of none. None. And Sarah says, I've got a plan. Remember that? What was the plan? I'm going to provide my handmaiden, Hagar, and I want you to have relations with her, and we'll help God out. Because I don't know if you've noticed, Abraham, you're 86 now, and God still hasn't delivered son number one, much less the stars in the heavens. We need to start this thing, and we need to start it now, because again, Abram still, you're 86. And he has a son, Ishmael. And God says, great, thanks for helping me out. That's exactly what I had in mind. We'll bless them, and he's going to, no.
You have no idea what you've done.
What are you doing? This is not what I told you. Ishmael is not going to be the son of promise. He is not going to be the son of the covenant. That's not how it's going to work. Abram goes on, and at age 99, Ishmael is 13. God comes to him again in chapter 17 and says, you know that son I promised you? Now it's going to happen. 99. His wife is 90. And God says, now you're going to get the son of promise. I don't know if you know what happens in there, but Abram goes, well, tell you what, why don't we stick with Ishmael? And how about if he finds favor in your sight? And God says, no. It's not happening. That's not how it's going to work. It's not that's not the one I promised. And Abram is renamed to Abraham. And Abraham, anybody knows what that means? Many nations, are the father of multitudes. The most literal translation. The father of multitudes. So before he was the father of many, now he's the father of multitudes at age 99. And he has how many of that multitude so far? One. He has the wrong one. Now, with all that said, let's ask a question here. God waits till Abram is 99 to say, now I'm going to fulfill the promise. Why did he wait so long?
Show that it was God doing it.
Because at 99,
He knew it wasn't man.
it wasn't going to be Abraham that produced this son. It wasn't going to be the actions of man. It wasn't going to be the plotting of Sarah. It was going to be God who was going to get the credit for fulfilling on this promise.
In Abraham and Sarah.
And there is where the point is, because again, the story is not so much about Abraham, it's about God. And you're going to notice that God is going to fulfill the promise, just like he said when he walked between those animals, I'm going to make this happen. Not you, not anyone else. Was Abraham's faith impressive?
Well, I would say yes.
I would say yes. Especially when we get far enough into the story that he finally gets the one son of promise, and we have the story we all remember when we think of the faith of Abraham. Abraham is told, take your son, the son that you love, your only son, and take him out and kill him and burn the body. And Abraham goes to bed that night, gets up the next morning, and does what?
Makes plans.
Takes the son, takes the wood, and heads off to do it. Now, we all stop there and we all look at that and go, what an incredible act of faith. But have you noticed how long it took for Abraham's faith to grow to the point that we have that incredible story? Abraham is called at age 60. He doesn't get a son till age 100. And now years later, when his son is older, Abraham finally has this moment. What has changed? What has Abraham been experiencing for decades now? Is the faithfulness of a God who keeps his word. And he started in faith. It was no small thing when you're called as out of Ur of the Chaldees as a pagan. I want you to leave everything you know and go out here to a place you don't know and follow. And there's some faith there. There was some stumbling, there were some issues, but have you noticed that over time, Abraham has learned something, that this God can be trusted. And you remember what Abraham's faith was based on? Why was he willing to kill that son? We found that out in Hebrews 11. The story was this. Abraham believed God would do something if he had to keep his promise with Isaac. And what did he believe that God would do? Raise him from the dead. How many people had Abraham seen raised from the dead? Or as we can tell, none. Why did Abraham trust God?
It was the only one.
What's that?
It was the only one.
No place else to turn. And how big, this is very important. Abraham's faith was great, but the reason Abraham's faith was great is because the greatness of the God in whom he trusted. You understand how different the God that Abraham was following was than all the gods Abraham used to worship. Do you know how small pagan gods are? How incapable they are of fixing the situation? We are seeing Abraham's faith is based in a God big enough to deal with the problem. This is what we have to understand. The actions of faith were based on a God big enough to deliver. Our faith has to be in the right God if you want it to be the right kind of faith. Now, let's bring this together and get back into our passage and see what we can find. There are several things I want you to see here today. I want you to see the actions of faith in verses 18 to 21. We're going to have a little survey of that. He's going to talk about the actions that Abraham. We're going to see God's answer to that faith. And then finally, at the very end, there'll be an analysis of faith that tells us this. Why does God tell us this story? And that's what we're going to see here in this section we're looking at in verses 18 to 25. Now let me start this in verses 18 to 21. I want to take a look at this aspect of faith, the actions of it. Starting in verse 18, it says this. In hope he believed against hope, that he should become the father of many nations. As he had been told, so shall your offspring be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No unbelief, put it this way, made him waver concerning the promise of God. But he grew strong in his faith, and he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Now let's take a look at that. He starts out and he says, here's the something you understand about Abraham's faith. He hoped against hope. What does that mean, that phrase? You heard that before? Hope against hope?
Yeah.
What do you mean by hope against hope? You're hoping in something that doesn't appear to have any human reason to believe it would happen. Doesn't seem possible. Exactly. You know what hoping against hope is called? Faith. Abraham is going to again put his trust in what God said rather than what appearances would say when he looks around. He hoped when there was no hope. He believed in a God big enough to do what he said. And again, understand the nature of Abraham's faith. That's always been a question. God calls Abraham out of Ur, and Abraham responds in faith and believes in God. And we're not told at all why Abraham believed God. The passage doesn't tell us any reason. Why would Abraham be believing in a God that says, I want you to leave everything you know, I want you to leave one of the richest places in the world at the time, leave your family, go out to a place you've never been and don't understand. And this Canaan wasn't a garden then. I mean, we hear about it later as a land of milk and honey. But at the time Abraham's going out, this is a backwoods area. It's not a great place to live. He's going to have to live in a tent the rest of his life. Why would Abraham trust God to do that? Why would he hope against hope?
Something unique and different about this God.
Evidently, God makes a tremendous first impression. I'm going to have to say, this guy came out, and again, where does the book of Romans begin? The book of Romans begins and says, God has revealed who he is. How did he do that? In his creation first. When you look at a God that can create all of that, how big of a God is that? This is a God who made life. Do you understand trusting a God who can create life, that he can restore life if he needs to? Abraham began with a very simple understanding. This God is different. This God is someone I can trust in ways I could not trust any of the gods I have been worshiping so far. So he put his faith in this God. Now look at verse 19. It says, and he did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body. And in verse 20, he was strong in his faith. You get the positive, the negative. Now he had waited a long time for a son. Doesn't it get hard to continue to pray for something that God does not deliver in the time frame you'd like? You ever had something like that where it's continually coming back to this and you're going, I mean, most of us, weeks is a test. Months is beyond. I mean, if God was going to do it, he would have done it. I'm moving on. I'm through. Years, but decades? Decades of waiting for God to deliver on this and keeping faith in that? That is a very different approach. And a few of you out there know what it means for God to deliver something that seemed out of reach and something you have prayed for decades that never seemed to be coming. But that's a very special kind of thing, to wait on God that long. But Abraham saw God big enough to deliver. He waited for all that. It wasn't limited to what he experienced. Again, he believed that a God that could create life could bring life back. And so he trusted even to the point of offering his son. God was bigger than the natural weaknesses of Abraham. And I like this. Abraham is told he's going to father his son at 99. Now, a natural assessment of himself is in the text here. God says you're going to have a son. Abraham says, I'm 99. I just need to mention this. I can no longer contribute to this process. That's what he's saying. In regards to procreation, God, my body is dead. And I don't know if you noticed, Sarah was never able to have a child, and she's 90 now, and if my body is dead, well, I'm just saying, thought I'd point out the facts so that you remember who you're talking to and how long it's been. The facts do not line up with the promise. You get that? Does that make sense to Abraham? Does that make sense to you? Would that argument be fairly convincing in the situation?
Sure.
I think so. But again, the story of Abraham is more about God than it is about Abraham. And he's going to answer the prayer. Now I want to notice something in verse 20, because this is one that really hits me. No unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God.
But
No unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God. Now, that word waver is diakrino in the Greek, and the word krino means to judge, and dia means to judge between two things. And basically what diakrino refers to, wavering, is when you have two decisions in front of you and you keep going, well, this sounds like a great one, and you go, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And then a few minutes, you go, no, wait a minute, maybe I ought to do this one. You ever been in that situation where you go back and forth and you can argue one side so perfectly, and then as soon as you do, you argue the other side, and you're just sitting there, what am I supposed to do? They both seem to make sense. And it is saying that Abraham never had that moment. Now, I want you to go to Genesis chapter 17 for a second, and let's see how this works out. Because Genesis 17 has an interesting story. Chapter 17, starting in verse 3. And God said to Abram, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be your name, and I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her, and I will bless her, she shall become nations, kings of people shall come from her. And then Abraham fell on his face and worshiped God, thanking him for the promise to be fulfilled. What does yours say there? He fell on his face and did what? He laughed. He was laughing. He literally fell over on his face laughing. I am not suggesting to you he's laughing in joy because of what God is doing. I think he's laughing at the prospect and going, come on. Sarah laughed in her tent. I don't think her laugh was a laugh of joy. Now, as I look at that, I don't know about you, but I'm sensing a little bit of doubt and a little bit of going back and forth. This is what God is saying, but this is what I think about that, and they don't line up. How can Paul make that statement about Abraham's faith when Abraham so obviously looked at that and says, I'm finding this one hard to believe? How can you say he never wavered?
it was a good story.
I want you to think about something here. The aspect of faith in Scripture does not come down to never struggling in belief. It comes down to the time when you have to act on what God said in spite of that struggle. And what did Abraham always do when it came down to it? When God said, this is what you do, and Abraham's going, I don't understand, I'm having trouble believing, but what did Abraham always choose when it came time to act? I'll follow God. I have no idea how he's going to do this, I have no idea how he's going to pull this off by any.
It wouldn't require faith.
What's that?
If you could see how it worked out, it doesn't require faith.
Absolutely. So again, when Paul describes this, it comes down to what are you going to act on? And will you act on faith? When you go, I don't see it, but God said. This is what God said, it's how it's going to go. And he acted on that. Abraham had doubts like any one of us. God fulfilling this promising beyond the ability, and how he felt in the moment was not always ideal. But when it finally came down to it, Abraham always chose to follow God. And that's why he's a man of faith. That's the distinction. John Calvin, some of you may not be fans of John Calvin. I am a big fan of John Calvin, but I like this is what he said. We are never so enlightened that there does not remain ignorance in our hearts. Nor is our heart so established that there are no misgivings. With those evils of our nature, faith maintains a perpetual conflict, in which conflict it is often sorely shaken and put to great stress. But if it be faith, it always conquers. I really love that. He goes, when it comes down to it, if it's really faith, that's what's going to come out in the end. Yes, these weaknesses in my character are there. Yes, they make me say and do stupid things at times. But ultimately, if it is faith, it will conquer and move forward. We are told, especially in our text in verse 20, that back in Romans, that Abraham grew strong as he gave glory to God. Do you understand that's what he came in? Each time he says, I'm going to choose what God said, and I'm going to trust in that, and that gave God glory. 1 John tells us this, that when you look at the promise of God and you say, I don't trust that, and I'm not going to put my trust in that, you're calling God a liar. That's what you're saying. God, you lied. I can't trust your word on this. And this is what Abraham did. He purposed to glorify God. Trusting God. The reason I like the story of Abraham is because it is so much more real and personal than most of the other stories that we talk about with great faith. We love to talk about Daniel in the lion's den. I'm going to be thrown in and consumed by lions, and he stood firm with God. The fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're the names that were given to them. They're going to be thrown in. Well, stand by God. And most of us are not going to have a fiery furnace moment. Our tests for faith in God are going to be much more personal, much more day-to-day, living in a culture that challenges the promises of God and tells us they don't make sense. Think about the message our culture has for us today and what they're going out there. There was literally a meeting of a group calling themselves Democratic Socialist that were saying that they see great signs for their future movement in the American culture, and they said, women are finally claiming their independence from marriage and male dominance in the society. And they said, we have great hope because we have seen so many women in the black community who now do not let a man be involved in the process of having, other than his original contribution, of having and raising children. This is what they said. They see this as a hopeful sign. Now I want you to stop and think. What are the results of breaking the family down and having children out of wedlock and raised by a woman alone? Poverty is off the scale. Crime is off the scale. And yet they see this as hope. Abuse.
Lack of balance.
It destroys a culture. It absolutely rips the heart out of it.
Yep.
And condemns it to destruction. And yet they're saying that this sign that is so hopeful, that they're hopeful that all other women across the board will follow this model to the perfect world.
From the pit.
This is what the world is telling us is the best future. That God's idea of family, that God's idea of marriage right now, it is common for young men especially to say, you know, I'm not even going to bother with this because it's not worth the risk. And can you tell me horror stories of what have happened in marriages? Have we seen it in our own church with things that have seen in families torn apart? Absolutely. But God promised that there are certain things that are better. and that the pursuit of them is what we are supposed to do. And what are we going to choose? What values are we going to put in front of us? What things are we going to try to make right? Or are we going to cave to the culture and say, you're right, it's just too hard, it's too difficult now, we can't do that. Our trust in things, our understanding of how to raise children, our understanding of the values we're supposed to instill. The culture is going to challenge us on all of these things. Are there good common sense ways? What is true, if it's not working, is we need to go back to what the text says, not what the world tells us is the solution. God will help us fix it. Is there a problem? Boy, is there. Are there people that have done foolish things? Are there things that sin just tears apart? Have you seen some men and some women actually destroyed what their spouses do? Absolutely. But we are asked to trust God and not be intimidated by the world. Verse 21 says that Abraham lived by the conviction that what God had promised was what he was going to believe. You see that? I love how that comes in here. Fully convinced that God was able to do what he has promised. Why did he have that? Remember what it said in verse 17 about this whole thing of God? In the presence of God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead, calls into existence the things that do not exist. Why did he trust God? This God was big enough to deliver. He could call into things that had never existed and make them exist. This is the God who writes history, does not respond to it. I get so tired of theologians that say that, you know what, here's what God does. He looks down the corridors of time and sees all the decisions you're going to make, and then he adjusts accordingly. God does not let you dictate to him what he's going to do. God writes history. He does not respond to it. Understand again, Abraham did something that most men are not willing to do. He was willing to believe in a God that was bigger than his comfort zone. Men invent their own gods because they want a God that is small enough to make them comfortable and a God that will do what they want him to do, rather than a God who writes history and demands that you do what he wants you to do. We're not comfortable with that God, and we don't want to follow that God. But that's the only God that is big enough to provide redemption.
Hope against hope.
Hope against hope. When there seems to be no reason to hope. Now what happens when you have that kind of faith? We'll look at verse 22 here. This is why his faith was counted to him as righteousness. That kind of faith is the faith that follows God and gains the redemption of God. That is what it does. I trust that God can do this and I can't, and then God can give you righteousness. That's how it works. That is why his faith is from. But here's now verse 23. But the words, it is counted to him, were not written for his sake alone. Now this is the important part. Why is this story recorded? Was it because Abraham wanted to get himself in the book and had made, wanted to get out there so he'd be historically remembered forever? That's what Alexander the Great did. He took an historian with him and all his conquests to make sure that everybody knew that it was Alexander that did this. Was that what Abraham did?
There was no book.
There was no book. There was no Moses to write it. Remember how this all worked? Why do we know Abraham was saved by God? Because he wasn't saved by circumcision, because God gave him the promise of redemption and righteousness 14 years before he was circumcised. He wasn't justified by the law, because the law came 430 years after he was dead. So that didn't do it. And if those two things didn't save him, how was he saved? What's the only thing left? God made him righteous. How did he make him righteous? And here it comes. Faith in two things. What God had done, he looked at creation, he looked at what God had already done, and by basing that on what God had already done, he put faith in what God would do. And what did God promise Abraham he would do? 2,000 years later. Send a Redeemer. Is our faith different than that? It is based on what God has done. We can see the Creator God, we can see the Redeemer, but has God delivered on everything he promised in our salvation yet? No. Not yet. So is our faith the same? Based on what God has done, we trust in everything God says he will do? This is the faith we're understanding. And the story is to make you understand that's what faith looks like. It was written for your benefit. It was written for you to understand that it is God who does this. It is God that works this out. Why do we tell the Bible stories? Why do we constantly go back in here and find the things that God has said? Because it's important that we understand how God works. And this is from Psalm 78. Starting in verse 5. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which commanded our fathers to teach their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn. He said, here's a law. I want you to take what God wrote here, and I want you to teach it to your children, and I want you to commit to me. You'll teach it to the children that aren't even born yet. Why did he want them to do that? And arise and tell to their children, so that they should act in their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. That they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. You know what you need to do? You need to teach your children what God said. They won't be as stupid as you were. There's a hard one, isn't it? No, he's not saying that necessarily. He's saying this. How far did you have to look for somebody who did it wrong? Because generally you didn't have to look outside your own family. There's somebody close to you that did it wrong that you can go, I don't want my kids to do that. So it was written so we would understand how God does things. It was written so we would get the point and not do things the same way sinners have done it before us. And we should make it plain to our children so they won't make those mistakes either. So it was not for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be counted to us who believe in him, who raised him from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, who delivered up for our trespasses and raised us for justification. He's saying this. It's going to work for us if we remember how God works and act in faith. If you understand how God saves, you will come and act in faith, and God will do what he did for Abraham. He will change the conditions of life. He will alter the course of history for you. This is the God you're trying to follow. A redeemer. And understand this. This is important. He said you have to put your trust in God and a redeemer. Any old redeemer? Which redeemer does he specifically name here? Jesus Christ. He's saying it has to be God's story, God's way, and God's redeemer. And this is important. How do we know which redeemer to believe in? Where do you go to find the story of Jesus? Back to Scripture. Go back to the text. Because if you listen to this world, have you heard the descriptions of Jesus going on out there in the mouths of our celebrities and in the mouths of... They love to bring Jesus up. And it is amazing that the Jesus they know always supports the thing they want to do. Jesus would be a fan of this. Jesus would be right here with us. The ladies, if you want to hear the worst version of Jesus, I challenge you to listen to the Ladies of the View a few times on television. Because the Jesus they mention is involved in a lot of stuff I don't find in here. And supportive of stuff that God condemns in here. So it has to be the right God and the right Redeemer. Because as we said before, faith in the wrong thing is not faith at all. Believing in what is not true is not going to help anyone. It's got to be faith in the real God and the Redeemer he sent. All described by him in his book. Because the entire story is not about us, it's about God. Tim, if you want to pop the button there. That puts the